The year is 1940. And something isn't right.
In the prehistory of civilization, many societies rose and fell, but few left as clear and extensive an account of what happened to them and why, as the 21st century nation-states that refer to themselves as Western civilization. Even today, 2 millennia after the collapse of the Roman and Mayan empires and 1 millennium after the end of the Byzantine and Inca empires, historians, archaeologists, and synthetic failure paleontologists have been unable to agree on the primary cause of those societies' loss of population, power, stability, and identity. The case of Western civilization is different because the consequences of its actions were not only predictable, but predicted. Moreover, this technologically transitional society left extensive records both in 20th century style paper and in 21st century electronic formats, permitting us to reconstruct what happened in extraordinarily clear detail. In the mid-20th century, some physical scientists, named as such due to the archaic Western convention of studying the physical world in isolation from social systems, recognized that the anthropogenic increment of CO2 could theoretically warm the planet. Few were concerned. Total emissions were still quite low. In any case, most scientists view the atmosphere as an essentially unlimited sink. In the 1970s, scientists began to recognize that human activities were changing the physical and biological functions of the planet in consequential ways, giving rise to the Anthropocene period of geological history. None of the scientists who made the early discoveries was particularly visionary. Many of the relevant studies were byproducts of nuclear weapons testings and development. It was the rare man, in those days sex discrimination was widespread, who understood that he was in fact studying the limits of planetary sinks. A notable exception was the futurist Paul Ehrlich, whose book The Population Bomb was widely read in the late 1960s, but was considered to be discredited by the 1990s. Historians view 1988 as the start of the prenumbrial period. In that year, world scientific and political leaders created a new hybrid scientific governmental organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is also known today as the IPCC, to communicate relevant science and form the foundation for international governance to protect the planet and its citizens. But before the movement to change could really take hold, there was backlash. Critics claim that the scientific uncertainties were too great to justify the expenses and the inconvenience of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, and that any attempt to solve the problem would cost more than it was worth. At first, just a handful of people made this argument, almost all of them in the United States. Some countries tried but failed to force the United States into international cooperations. Other nations used inertia in the United States to excuse their own patterns of destructive development. There were notable exceptions. China, for instance, took steps to control its population and convert its economy to non-carbon-based energy sources. These efforts were little noticed and less emulated in the West, in part because Westerners viewed Chinese population control efforts as immoral, and in part because the country's exceptionally fast economic expansion led to dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions, masking the impact of renewable energy. By 2050, this impact became clear as China's emissions began to fall rapidly. Had other nations followed China's lead, the history recounted here might have been very different. The year 2009 is viewed as the last best chance the Western world had to save itself, as leaders met in Copenhagen, Denmark to try for the 15th time since the UNFCCC was written to agree on a binding international law to prevent disruptive climate change. 2 years before, scientists involved in the IPCC had declared anthropogenic warming to be unequivocal, and public opinion polls showed that a majority of people, even in the reluctant United States, believed that action was warranted. But shortly before the meeting, a massive campaign was launched to discredit the scientists whose research underpinned the IPCC's conclusion. This campaign was funded primarily by fossil fuel corporations whose annual profits at the time exceeded the GDPs of most countries. Public support for action evaporated. Even the President of the United States felt unable to move his nation forward. Meanwhile, climate change was intensifying. In 2010, record-breaking summer heat and fires killed more than 50,000 people in Russia and resulted in more than $15 billion in damages. The following year, massive floods in Australia affected more than 250,000 people. In 2012, which became known in the United States as the year without a winter temperature records, including for the highest overnight lows, were shattered, something that should have been an obvious cause for concern.
Even then, political, business, and religious leaders refused to accept that what lay behind the increasing destructiveness of these disasters was the burning of fossil fuels. More heat in the atmosphere meant more energy had to be dissipated, manifesting as more powerful storms, bigger deluges, and deeper droughts. It was that simple. But a shadow of ignorance and denial had fallen over people who considered themselves children of the Enlightenment. It is for this reason that we now know this era as the period of the penumbra. Physical scientists who spoke out about the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change were accused of being alarmist and of acting out of self-interest. Legislation was passed, particularly in the United States, that placed limits on what scientists could study and how they could study it. Meanwhile, the Government Spending Accountability Act of 2012 restricted the ability of government scientists to attend conferences to share and analyze the results of their research. Then followed U.S. National Stability Protection Act of 2025, which led to the conviction and imprisonment of more than 300 scientists for endangering the safety and well-being of the general public with unduly alarming threats. By exaggerating the threat, it was argued, scientists were preventing the economic development essential for coping with climate change. It is difficult to understand why humans did not respond appropriately in the early penumbral period, when preventive measures were still possible. Many have sought an answer in the general phenomenon of human adaptive optimism, which later proved crucial for survivors. This reductionist approach, sometimes credited to the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, but not fully developed until the late 19th century, was believed to give intellectual power and vigor to investigations by focusing on singular elements of complex problems. Tractability was a guiding ideal of the time. Problems that were too large or complex to be solved in their totality were divided into smaller, more manageable elements. While reductionism proved powerful in many domains, particularly quantum physics and medical diagnostics, it impeded investigations of complex systems. Reductionism also made it difficult for scientists to articulate the threat posed by climate change, since many experts did not actually know very much about aspects of the problem beyond their expertise. It was often said, for example, that climate change was caused by increased atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Scientists understood that those greenhouse gases were accumulating because of the activities of human beings, deforestation and fossil fuel combustion, yet they rarely said that the cause was people and their patterns of conspicuous consumption. In an almost childlike attempt to demarcate their practices from those of older explanatory traditions, scientists felt it necessary to prove to themselves and the world how strict they were in their intellectual standards. Thus, they placed the burden of proof on novel claims, even empirical claims about phenomena that their theories predicted. This included claims about changes in the climate.
Western scientists built an intellectual culture based on the premise that it was worse to fool oneself into believing in something that did not exist than not to believe in something that did. So, while the pattern of weather events was clearly changing, many scientists insisted that these events could not yet be attributed with certainty to anthropogenic climate change. Even as lay citizens began to accept this link, the scientists who studied it did not. More importantly, political leaders came to believe that they had more time to act than they really did. By 2012, more than 365 billion tons of carbon had been emitted to the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion and cement production alone. Another 180 billion tons were added from deforestation and other land use changes. Remarkably, more than one half of these emissions occurred after the mid-1970s, after scientists had built computer models demonstrating that greenhouse gases would cause warming. What is even stranger is that two of the wealthiest countries in the world, the US and Canada, continued to increase emissions, even though data showed that they were harming the environment. Oil prices plummeted, and this became a cheap source of energy that spurred further consumption, while at the same time making it economically unviable to back clean energy startups and other renewable resources. Meanwhile, Arctic sea ice continued to melt, and seaways opened that permitted further exploitation of oil and gas reserves in the North Polar region. Again, scientists noted what was happening, but nobody listened. By the mid-2010s, Arctic summer sea ice had lost about 30% of its area compared to 1979. When high-precision satellite measurements were made, it showed that this area was realistically thought to be more like 50%. The year 2007 was particularly worrisome as the famous Northwest Passage, long sought after by explorers, finally opened and polar seas became navigable by ships for the first time in human history. Scientists understood that it was only a matter of time before the Arctic summer would be ice-free, and this was a grave concern. But in business and economic circles, this was an opportunity for further oil and gas exploitation. By 2040, heat waves and droughts were the norm. Control measures, such as food rationing and one-child policies, were widely implemented. In wealthy countries, hurricane and tornado-prone regions were gradually but steadily depopulated, putting social pressure on areas less subject to those hazards. In poor nations, conditions were even worse. Rural portions of Africa and Asia began to experience massive levels of migration, malnutrition, and disease spread quickly. Still, sea level had only risen about 10 centimeters around the globe, and coastal populations were mostly intact. Then, in the summer of 2041, unprecedented heat waves scorched the planet and destroyed crops around the globe. Panic ensued, with massive riots in many major cities. Mass migration following this, coupled with explosive increases in insect populations, led to many insect-borne diseases being spread around the world. As social order began to break down in the 2050s, governments were overthrown, particularly in Africa, but also in Asia and Europe, further decreasing social capacity to deal with increasingly desperate populations. The great North American desert surged north and east, consuming many major food production locations in the States. Countries all around the globe began to create resource-sharing alliances.
At the first International Emergency Summit on Climate Change, participants hastily wrote and signed the United Nations Convention on Climate Engineering and Protection. The International Aerosol Injection Climate Engineering Project, sometimes called the Crutzen Project after the scientist who first suggested the idea in 2006, began to inject sub-micrometer-sized sulfate particles into the stratosphere, expecting to reduce mean global temperatures by 0.1 degrees Celsius annually from 2059 to 2079. The first 3 years of the IAI-CEP were successful, but in the project's fourth year, the shutdown of the Indian monsoon occurred, and crop failures and famine swept across India. India now called for the IAI-CEP's immediate cessation. The termination shock that came with the abrupt ending of the IAI-CEP in 2063 pushed the mean global temperature increase to nearly 5 degrees Celsius. By now, Arctic summer ice was completely gone, and scores of species perished, including the iconic polar bear. The widespread thawing of Arctic permafrost and release of methane doubled the total atmospheric carbon load. This massive addition of carbon led to what is known as the Sagan effect, a strong positive feedback loop between warming and methane release. Planetary temperatures increased by an additional 6 degrees Celsius over the 5-degree rise that had already occurred. The ultimate blow for Western civilization came in the form of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Extreme heat in the northern hemisphere disrupted normal patterns of ocean circulation, sending exceptionally warm surface waters into the southern ocean that destabilized the ice sheet from below. From 2073 to 2093, approximately 90% of the ice sheet broke apart, disintegrated, and melted, driving up sea level approximately 5 meters across most of the globe. The Greenland ice sheet also split apart, adding another 2 meters to mean global sea level rise. These cryogenic effects were soon referred to as the Great Collapse, although this term is now more broadly used to include the interconnected social, economic, political, and demographic collapse that ensued. This 8-meter sea level rise dislocated about 20% of the world population. This dislocation of 1.5 billion people contributed to the Second Black Death, as a new strain of bacteria emerged in Europe and spread to Asia and North America. This second Black Death killed as much as half the population. Disease also spread among stressed non-human populations, and it is not unrealistic to estimate that 60 to 70% of species were driven to extinction. Around 2090, Japanese genetic engineer Akari Ishikawa developed a form of lichenized fungus in which the photosynthetic partner consumed atmospheric CO2 much more efficiently than existing forms and was able to grow in a wide diversity of environmental conditions. This fungus was released from Ishikawa's laboratory and spread rapidly throughout Japan and then across most of the globe. Within 2 decades, it had visibly altered the visual landscape and measurably altered atmospheric CO2, starting the globe on the road to atmospheric recovery and the world on the road to social, political, and economic recovery.
To the historian studying this tragic period of human history, the most astounding fact is that the victims knew what was happening and why. There is no easy answer to the question of why this catastrophe occurred, but key factors stand out. The thesis of this analysis is that Western civilization became trapped in the grip of 2 inhibiting ideologies, positivism and market fundamentalism. This philosophy held that through experience, observation, and experiment, one could gather reliable knowledge about the natural world, and that this knowledge would empower its holder. But that this knowledge would translate into power proved inaccurate. Power did not reside in the hands of those who understood the climate system, but rather in the political, economic, and social institutions that had a strong interest in maintaining the use of fossil fuels, named the carbon combustion complex. Many scientists, to their credit, recognized the difficulties they were facing and grappled with how to communicate their knowledge effectively. While they were making some headway, a large part of Western society was rejecting that knowledge in favor of an empirically inadequate yet powerful ideological system. Even at this time, some recognized this system as a quasi-religious faith, hence the label market fundamentalism. The philosophy maintained that free markets were not merely a good or even the best manner of satisfying material wants. They were the only manner of doing so that did not threaten personal freedom. This aspect of the philosophy, called neoliberalism, harkened back to the liberalism of the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment, particularly the works of Adam Smith, David Hume, John Locke, and later, John Stuart Mill. Reacting to the dominant form of Western governance in their time, that is, monarchy, these thinkers ionized personal liberty in the market failure contrast to control by unjust, arbitrary, and often incompetent deposits. In the 19th century, power became concentrated in the hands of the industrialists, the robber barons, monopolies, and trusts of the United States and elsewhere. Challenging liberal conceptions of desirability of weak political governance, industrialists not only employed workers under brutal and tyrannical conditions, they also corrupted democratic processes through bribery, extortion, and distorted the marketplace through a variety of practices. The Great Depression of the 1930s, from which Europe and the United States emerged only through the centralized mobilization of World War II, led scholars and political leaders to view the idea of self-regulating markets as a myth. After World War II, most non-communist states became mixed economies, with a large degree of both individual and corporate freedom and significant government involvement in the markets, including extensive systems of taxes, tariffs, subsidies, regulation of banks and exchanges, and immigration control. Based on this failure, a new ideology gained momentum. Neoliberalism was developed by a group of thinkers, most notably Australian Frederick von Hayek and American Milton Friedman, who were particularly sensitive to repressive centralized government. In 2 key works, von Hayek's Road to Serfdom and Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, they developed the crucial neo-component of neoliberalism, the idea that free market systems were the only economic systems that did not threaten individual liberty.
However, when environmental science showed that government action was needed to protect citizens and the natural environment from unintended harms, the carbon combustion complex began to treat science as an enemy to be fought by whatever means necessary. The very science that had led to U.S. victory in World War II and dominance in the Cold War became the target of skepticism, scrutiny, and attack. As a result, The 1990s and 2000s featured a wave of deregulation that weakened consumer, worker, and environmental protections. Because science had been ignored for so long, government intervention was now required in order to raise the market price of harmful products, to promote those products, or to finance the development of the replacements. But because neoliberals were so hostile to centralized government, they had, as Americans used to say, painted themselves into a corner. The American people had been persuaded, in the words of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, that government was the problem and not the solution. Citizens slid into passive denial, accepting the contrarian arguments that the science was unsettled. Lacking widespread support, government leaders were unable to shift the world economy to a net carbon-neutral energy base. As the world climate began to spin out of control and the implications for market failure became undisputable, scientists came under attack, blamed for problems they had not caused, but rather had only documented. If only we had listened to von Hayek, who simply and reasonably believed that if government were able to carry out such functions, and practically, if doing so selectively limited the freedom of particular groups or individuals, then the justification for the intervention should be clear. Market 48 failure, however, was very clear and compelling. Given the events recounted here, it is hard to imagine why anyone in the 20th century would have argued against government protection of the natural environment on which human life depends. Yet, such arguments were not just made, but they dominated the public sphere. The ultimate paradox was that neoliberalism, meant to ensure individual freedom above all, led eventually to a situation that necessitated large-scale government intervention. But actionable freedom was decreasing. First, as economic power was increasingly concentrated in a tiny elite, who became to be known as the 1%, and then in the political elite, who propelled themselves to power as the climate crisis forced dramatic interventions to relocate citizens who had been displaced by sea level rise and desertification, to contain contagion, and to prevent mass famine. And so, the development that neoliberals most dreaded, centralized government and loss of personal choice, was rendered essentially by the very politics that they had once put in place.